My name is Tinashe Dube. I've been a ranger in Zimbabwe's Gonarezhou National Park for over 20 years. Long enough to watch the land change, the rivers run dry and swell again, the elephants shift their paths, and the skies darken and clear. But nothing prepared me for what I saw one quiet morning in early May, 5 years ago. It began as a routine patrol. The kind of day where the only sound is the crunch of dry leaves under your boots, the occasional rustle of a francolin in the grass, and the soft sigh of wind through mopane trees. I was with my partner, Elias, a man of few words and sharp eyes. We were walking along the southern boundary, close to the Save River, in an area that hadn't seen much traffic in months. The region had always felt forgotten. Tourists rarely ventured that far, and even poachers had shifted their routes after we tightened surveillance. There was a silence to it, an eerie, expectant kind of silence. We moved through it quietly, checking old snare lines, reading tracks. It was mid-morning when Elias stopped abruptly and knelt. He motioned for me to come closer. There, pressed into the sandy soil, were prints, not hyena, not jackal. I leaned in. "Painted dogs," Elias said. His voice was flat, but I heard something in it. A hesitation, or maybe disbelief. African wild dogs, painted wolves, some called them, for their dappled coats. I hadn't seen a single one in over 10 years. None of us had. They were gone, everyone thought. Extinct in the park, at least. The last confirmed sighting had been in 2011, by a tourist who managed a blurry photo of what might have been a lone dog near Chiloho Cliffs. Nothing since. Most assumed they'd been wiped out, by disease, by snares, by shrinking ranges. But the tracks were fresh. Hours old, maybe less. I felt a jolt of something I hadn't felt in years, cautious hope. We followed the prints deeper into the bush, careful not to disturb them. The dogs were moving in a loose formation, maybe 5 or 6, judging by the spacing. They'd crossed a dry stream bed, lingered near a patch of shade, then angled toward a cluster of thick shrubs near a termite mound. Elias stopped again. "Scat," he said, pointing. It was fresh, unmistakable. We stood still, listening. And then, a rustle. A sharp bark. Not like a jackal or a hyena. A wild dog's alarm call. We dropped low, scanning the bushes. Movement flickered between the trees, tan, black, white. Fast. Then another flash, a leg, a tail. And suddenly, there they were. 6 of them, coats smeared with dust, but unmistakable. They moved like shadows, fluid and alert. One paused on a low ridge and looked straight at us. Eyes bright, head cocked. I remember not breathing. The air around us seemed to hold its breath too. We didn't follow them. We watched as they melted back into the bush, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. When the silence returned, it wasn't empty anymore. It was electric. That evening, back at base, I called in the sighting. The reaction was instant. Calls were made. Maps were pulled. A week later, the senior ecologist from the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority arrived, along with 2 researchers from Painted Dog Conservation. They wanted details, location, time, numbers. I told them everything. Then I took them back to the place. The dogs were gone, but the signs remained. More prints. Scat. A fresh kill site, an impala, cleanly taken down. There was no doubt. A pack was operating in the park. The months that followed were some of the most intense of my career. A full monitoring plan was drawn up. We placed camera traps in a grid, fanned out on foot patrols, and coordinated drone surveillance. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. They were a small pack, just 7 adults and 2 pups. That first sighting had missed the younger ones. But they were healthy, mobile, and adapting fast. We tracked them across a wide range, from the cliffs to the river basin, and even up toward the escarpment. It wasn't just a one-off sighting. They were back. But how? No one could say for sure. There was a population of painted dogs in the Save Valley Conservancy to the north. Maybe a splinter group had broken off, crossed through corridor land, and re-established in Gonarezhou. Maybe they'd been here all along, a remnant few, surviving deep in the thickets, unnoticed. Whatever the case, their return was nothing short of miraculous. What followed was even more surprising. The pack began to grow. By the next breeding season, the alpha female had birthed 8 pups. Our camera traps captured the first images. a line of tiny figures emerging from a den at dusk, nipping at each other, wobbling through the dust behind their mother. We were stunned. For years, we'd fought against the tide, poaching, human encroachment, climate pressure. Wild dogs, once widespread across sub-Saharan Africa, had been reduced to fragmented populations. Gonarezhou, like so many other parks, had lost them. And now, somehow, they were back. It wasn't luck. It was the result of hard work, by rangers, scientists, local communities. Years of tightening anti-poaching patrols, shutting down snare lines, and creating buffer zones. The wild dogs had returned because we had made it possible for them to return. But it wasn't a simple victory. The challenges were real. There were livestock conflicts near the park's edge. One of the dogs was found limping, a snare wound visible on its foreleg. We increased patrols, held meetings with local farmers, and expanded community outreach. The conservation team launched school programs in surrounding villages, teaching children about the dogs and their role in the ecosystem. The park changed too. For the first time in years, wild dogs became part of the landscape again. Guides began mentioning them during safaris. Tourists began asking about them. A few lucky ones even saw them, sprinting across the plains, chasing impala with that unmatched, synchronized elegance. I followed them as often as I could. I knew their patterns, their routes. I named them, not officially, but in my own mind. The alpha male I called Chisungo, which means leader in Shona. The female, Namo, or resilience. She was fierce, bold, and brilliant in her strategies. One evening, near Mahenye, I saw the pack gather at a waterhole. They drank in turn, pups darting between adults. I watched from a distance, binoculars in hand, the light golden and slow. It was a moment I'll never forget. Because I knew what it meant. The dogs were not just surviving. They were thriving. In the second part of the story, I will tell you about how we monitored their dens during the next critical breeding season, and the surprising partnerships that grew from it, including how local communities began playing an unexpected role in protecting the dogs. But for now, this is how it started, with a footprint in the sand, a flash of movement in the trees, and a question that became a turning point in our work. What if extinction wasn't final? What if, sometimes, the wild could return? And what would we do to make sure it stayed? The months that followed the first confirmed return of African wild dogs to Gonarezhou National Park felt like we were walking on a wire, balanced between hope and uncertainty. One good season could mean population growth. One outbreak of disease, one wave of snares, could mean the end. Again, after the excitement of the initial sightings, the hard work truly began. It was June when the Painted Dog Conservation (PDC) team, working closely with our rangers and the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority (ZPWMA), began a coordinated monitoring campaign. The aim was to find the pack's den. We needed to know where they were raising their pups, and what threats might be surrounding them. In a place as vast and rugged as Gonarezhou, finding a den is no easy task. These animals are elusive, and their range spans over hundreds of square kilometers. But we had a starting point: camera traps along dry riverbeds and game trails, and the pack's hunting habits we'd observed. They were focusing their activity in the southern sector of the park, near the Rund River. By early July, we had our first breakthrough. One of the camera traps, placed near a rocky outcrop about 20 kilometers from Chipinda Pools, captured footage of an adult carrying meat in its jaws, a sure sign of provisioning behavior. A few days later, we spotted telltale signs: multiple adult tracks converging on one spot, returning again and again. That was it. The den. We moved carefully. Den sites are sensitive, and our presence had to be minimal to avoid disturbance. We set up a blind about 300 meters away, camouflaged beneath acacia branches. From there, using high-zoom optics, we began the long work of observation. What we saw stunned us. The alpha female, Namo, easily identified by the missing patch of fur on her shoulder from an old scar, had given birth to at least 10 pups. At first, they only peeked out cautiously, brown-eyed and clumsy. Within 2 weeks, they were tumbling over each other, wrestling near the entrance, and gnawing on regurgitated scraps the adults brought back. We took shifts. Days melted into weeks as we rotated teams to keep watch and record data. Each behavior, feeding times, adult pup interactions, territorial calls, was noted. The pups were healthy. The adults were efficient. It was textbook pack behavior, the kind rarely observed up close anymore. But then, an unexpected challenge emerged: human-wildlife conflict. The area just beyond the park boundary, near Melapati village, had been experiencing occasional livestock losses. Goats and chickens were disappearing from kraals. At first, people suspected hyenas. But then, one evening, a villager caught a glimpse of several wild dogs crossing a dirt road. The blame shifted quickly. The community meeting that followed was tense. I went as part of the park's delegation, along with the PDC liaison officer and Elias. We stood under a marula tree while elders and farmers voiced their anger. They had heard of the dogs, and while some were proud they had returned, others saw only the risk. I remember an elder named Vishoko rising to speak. His voice was quiet, but firm. "You tell us these dogs are rare, that they are important. But our goats are important too. Who will feed our children if the goats are taken?" It was a fair question. What came next was one of the most important shifts in the entire story of the dog's return: community inclusion. PDC proposed a compensation system. With funds from donors, they would reimburse farmers for any confirmed livestock losses caused by wild dogs, based on fair market value. But more than that, they introduced a community education initiative. We began hosting wildlife workshops in schools, showing children images and videos of the pack. We talked about how wild dogs were not pests, but vital parts of the ecosystem, expert hunters who kept prey populations in check and had one of the most cohesive social structures in the animal kingdom. The children responded first. They asked questions, drew pictures, gave names to the pups. Soon, their parents followed. Within 3 months, 5 community members from the villages near the park were recruited as wildlife guardians. Their job was to act as a bridge, reporting sightings, noting unusual behavior, and helping with patrols near vulnerable kraals. One of them, a young man named Bryden, quickly became a trusted part of our ranger team. He had sharp eyes and a deep respect for the bush. Together, we started to fortify livestock enclosures using thorn barriers and raised platforms. We taught villagers how to identify dog tracks versus those of jackals or hyenas. Trust began to grow. Back at the den, the pups were thriving. By September, they were joining the adults on short hunts, learning how to coordinate movements and avoid danger. We observed one remarkable event: a hunt that ended with a successful impala kill, and every pup getting a share. Chisungo, the alpha male, stood guard while the others fed. But the wild is never without danger. One day, Bryden came running to the ranger station. A pup had been found dead near a watering hole, puncture wounds on its side. We examined the carcass and determined the cause: lions. The top predator in the park had crossed paths with the dogs, and it had cost them. This was nature's balance. Still, it hit hard. We tightened monitoring, and we celebrated the small victories. In November, the den was abandoned, as expected. The pups were old enough to roam with the pack. They moved west, toward the escarpment, and began using new territory. We followed, carefully, ensuring their path remained free of snares. We also worked with aerial survey teams to scan for unreported den sites, hoping other packs might be out there. Then, in early December, something extraordinary happened. A second pack was sighted. This time, near the northern boundary of the park, close to the Save River. A tourist group from South Africa, led by a veteran guide, photographed a group of painted dogs, 9 individuals, none of which matched the markings of Namo's pack. We confirmed it a week later via a camera trap set near a game trail. We now had 2 packs in the park. We don't know where the second group came from. Perhaps from Save Valley Conservancy. Perhaps they too had survived, unnoticed, in the deeper corners of the park. But it no longer mattered. What mattered was that the wild dogs were no longer an isolated phenomenon. They were reclaiming the landscape. And we were changing with them. By the end of that year, the park had over 60 camera traps in use. Every ranger in the southern sector was trained in wild dog behavior and emergency response. Our partnership with PDC had expanded to include veterinary backup, ready to intervene if a snare injury was reported. Community guardian programs had grown to 9 villages, with over 300 schoolchildren now actively participating in conservation clubs. For the first time in decades, the African wild dog was not just a memory in Gonarezhou. It was a living, breathing presence. And for me, a ranger who had once believed I would never see one again, it felt like the land itself was healing. But the story doesn't end there. In the third and final part, I'll tell you how we began tracking pups born from the second pack, what new technology helped us understand their movements, and how neighboring countries took notice of what was happening in our corner of Zimbabwe. The wild dogs had returned. Now, it was up to us to ensure they would never disappear again. By the start of the next dry season, the news had spread far beyond the park's borders. Gonarezhou, long overlooked in comparison to Zimbabwe's more famous Hwane or Mana pools, had become a quiet epicenter of one of the rarest recoveries in African wildlife conservation, the resurgence of the African wild dog. Now with 2 confirmed packs, and whispers of a third, it was clear something remarkable was happening. And for us on the ground, the rangers, the researchers, the communities, it wasn't just about pride. It was about proving that with protection, with patience, and with collaboration, recovery was possible, even for a species thought to be locally extinct. The next step was data. We needed more than sightings. We needed to understand how these dogs were using the landscape, how far they were traveling, what threats they faced, and, most importantly, how to keep their population viable across generations. That's where collars came in. Painted Dog Conservation, working with Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority, ZPWMA, deployed GPS collars on selected individuals from each pack. It wasn't a decision we took lightly. Collaring is invasive and requires sedation, a risk in itself. But the data it yields is invaluable. With collars, we could track movement patterns, identify hunting grounds, detect denning sites, and respond in real time to threats. In May, we darted and collared 2 dogs, Chisungo, the alpha male from the southern pack, and a large female from the newer northern pack, which we now called the Chivarira pack, named after a small waterfall near their core territory. Chisungo recovered quickly, and within hours, the collar began transmitting. What followed was astonishing. In just a few weeks, his movements showed us that the pack was covering an area of more than 800 square kilometers, crisscrossing woodlands, open savannas, and even skirting the edges of settlements without being seen. The pack was smart, cautious, and incredibly adaptive. The most unexpected find came in July. Chivarira pack's collared female, who we called Maide, stopped moving for several days. At first, we feared injury or death. But the signal showed slight shifts around a single location near a rocky gorge. We suspected denning, and we were right. Another den. Another litter of pups. When we eventually observed the site from a safe distance, we counted at least 6 pups, and possibly more hidden from view. This meant that both packs had entered a second year of successful reproduction. In conservation terms, that was gold. But with more dogs came more risks. In August, one of the younger males from Chisungo's pack was found with a snare tightly wrapped around his neck. It was Brighton, one of our community guardians, who reported the sighting. We mobilized fast. The veterinary team flew in, and together we located and tranquilized the animal. The snare was removed, and after administering antibiotics and a tracker-free collar, we let him recover. We named him Vumai, meaning survivor. His case was not isolated. Over the next few months, we removed 4 more snares, 2 from wild dogs, and 2 from kudu. The bush was cleaner than it had been in years, but threats still lingered. This prompted a new strategy, the creation of rapid response anti-poaching units, trained not just in snare detection but in wildlife emergency care. These weren't outsiders, they were made up of seasoned rangers, young community recruits, and even former poachers who had been rehabilitated and trained. One of them, Tapiwa, had once been caught setting snares near the park. After a restorative justice program run by a conservation NGO, he joined a patrol team and quickly became an expert in spotting traps. His experience on the other side of the line became our strongest asset. By the end of that year, we had mapped every known pack's range, identified migration corridors, and documented more than 20 pups between the 2 packs, with survival rates exceeding 70%. That number is almost unheard of in the wild, especially for a species as vulnerable as the painted dog. International interest started building. Conservationists from Botswana, South Africa, and Tanzania reached out, curious to understand how Gonarezhou, with limited resources and no high-profile donors, had pulled off a grassroots recovery. The answer, we told them, wasn't money. It was people. It was the local elders who agreed to create buffer zones. It was the schoolchildren who reported injured animals. It was the farmers who built stronger kraals and called us instead of retaliating. It was the former poachers who helped clear snares they once set themselves. It was the rangers, underpaid, overworked, but relentless, who patrolled dusty tracks at midnight, armed with nothing but flashlights and resolve. In early 2023, we hosted a regional wildlife symposium in Gonarezhou. For the first time, park managers, rangers, and scientists from across southern Africa sat together and listened to our story. We shared maps, strategies, mistakes, and lessons. The most powerful moment came when Elias, quiet, stoic Elias, stood before the group and spoke. "I saw their prints before I saw them," he said. "And I remembered what it felt like when they were gone. This time, we won't let them go." Today, Gonarezhou has 4 confirmed packs of wild dogs. The total population is estimated at over 70 individuals. 3 years ago, we had none. Tourism has risen, especially among wildlife photographers and researchers. Local employment has grown, with more guides, trackers, and conservation officers trained every year. But perhaps most importantly, wild dogs are no longer viewed with fear or apathy. In villages where they were once blamed for livestock deaths, they are now spoken of with a mix of reverence and recognition. A new mural was painted on the school wall in Malapati last year. It shows a wild dog standing tall in the grass, surrounded by children, cattle, and trees. The caption, written in big block letters, says, "Kana takavadzivarira, tichagara pamwe shite." If we protect them, we can live together. And that's where I leave you. Not with an ending, but with a beginning. The story of the wild dog's return isn't just about a species bouncing back. It's about a place reclaiming its balance. It's about trust rebuilt between people and wildlife. It's about choosing protection over neglect. As a ranger, I've walked thousands of kilometers through this land. I've seen it broken and I've seen it heal. And now, when I hear the high-pitched yelps of painted dogs echoing through the bush at dusk, I know we did not just witness their return. We helped make it possible. And we will keep fighting to make sure they never vanish again.